When Barbara Hutton died in 1979, alone in a Los Angeles hotel room, her entire net worth came down to $3,500. Not million, not thousand, $3,500, roughly the price of a used car. Decades earlier, she had inherited a fortune worth close to $1 billion in today's money. This is the true story of how that entire fortune disappeared and what it actually teaches us about wealth, because the lesson here matters just as much for an ordinary family as it does for one of the richest names in American history. Stick around to the end, and if stories like this genuinely interest you, go ahead and hit follow right now before we get into it. To understand how this happened, we have to start decades earlier with the man who actually built the fortune in the first place, because the story of how it was built is just as remarkable as the story of how it disappeared. In 1879, a young man named Frank Winfield Woolworth was struggling. He had grown up on a farm in upstate New York, and by most accounts, he was genuinely bad at his early jobs working in retail. His employers reportedly told him outright that he simply didn't have what it took to be a salesman. But Frank had one idea he couldn't shake. At the time, most stores operated with prices you had to negotiate for, and merchandise kept locked behind a counter, fetched by a clerk only after you'd settled on a price. Frank wanted to flip that entire model. What if every item in the store had one fixed price, 5 cents, no negotiating at all, and customers could simply walk in, pick items up themselves, and decide on their own whether to buy them? His first attempt at this idea, a store in Utica, New York, failed within weeks. He didn't give up. He tried again in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and this time it worked. On opening day alone, the store brought in over $100 in sales, an amount Frank described in a letter to his father as the most he had ever sold in a single day. That store became the foundation for something enormous. By 1912, Frank had merged 5 competing chains together under his own name, instantly creating a company with nearly 600 stores. Within just a few more years, that number had grown past 1,000 locations across the United States, Canada, and England. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how radical this idea actually was for its time. The fixed-price, self-service retail model that Frank Woolworth pioneered is so completely normal today that it's genuinely hard to imagine shopping any other way. Every big box store, every supermarket, every modern retail chain you walk into today essentially still runs on the exact same basic principle Frank stumbled onto out of pure necessity back in 1879. He didn't set out to reinvent the entire retail industry. He was simply a struggling salesman trying to find any approach that might actually work for him personally. It just so happened that the approach he landed on ended up reshaping how the entire country would eventually shop for the next 100+ years. Then Frank built something that made his success impossible to ignore. In 1913, he completed the Woolworth Building in Lower Manhattan, a stunning tower that stood as the tallest building on the entire planet at the time, a title it held for close to 2 decades. Designed by the celebrated architect Cass Gilbert, the building was so visually striking that a clergyman speaking at its opening ceremony reportedly nicknamed it the Cathedral of Commerce. And here's the detail that really shows how far this farm boy had come. Frank paid for the entire building, more than $13 million in cash, with no loan and no mortgage whatsoever. The man nobody wanted to hire now owned the tallest building in the world, purchased outright without borrowing a single dollar. If you're the kind of person who genuinely appreciates a rags to riches story built on nothing but a 5-cent idea, make sure you're following this channel, because what happens to this fortune over the following decades is honestly one of the most dramatic collapses in American financial history. Before we get to that collapse, it's worth pausing on why so many people still remember Woolworths fondly, even generations after the stores themselves disappeared. It wasn't really the tallest building in the world that stuck in people's memory, it was the lunch counter. Nearly every Woolworths store had one, a long counter lined with chrome stools, serving grilled cheese sandwiches, banana splits, and cherry cokes for prices any kid could afford with pocket change. For millions of Americans growing up through the middle of the 20th century, the counter was often the very first restaurant they ever sat down at without a parent. By the 1960s, Woolworths was serving so many meals through these counters that its food operation genuinely rivaled the early years of McDonald's, almost entirely by accident. This wasn't a fortune built on oil fields or railroads or Wall Street speculation. It was built nickel by nickel from ordinary families buying small, affordable things at a store that felt like it belonged to their own neighborhood. There's something genuinely worth noticing in that contrast. The fortune that would eventually vanish so dramatically wasn't accumulated through some clever, complicated financial scheme understood only by a handful of bankers. It came from millions of completely ordinary transactions. A child buying a toy, a family splitting a sandwich, a teenager picking up a record, repeated across thousands of stores day after day for decades. That's part of what makes the eventual collapse of the family fortune sting a little more than it might otherwise. This wasn't abstract wealth pulled out of speculative markets. It was money built directly on the trust and everyday habits of ordinary American families, accumulated patiently over generations, only to disappear from the family that inherited it within the span of a single lifetime. Frank Woolworth died in 1919, and the circumstances of his death say something genuinely telling about the man. He developed a serious tooth infection, and despite being one of the wealthiest men in the country, capable of hiring the best dental care available anywhere, he refused to see a dentist at all due to a lifelong fear of them. The infection spread into blood poisoning, and at 66 years old, one of the most successful retailers in American history died from a problem that could have been easily treated. This is where the fortune's real trouble actually began, and it's the first of several critical mistakes worth understanding clearly. Frank had reportedly drawn up updated plans for how his estate should be distributed after his death, but he died before ever signing that updated will. As a result, his entire fortune passed under an older will, one written years earlier, going directly and entirely to his wife, Jenny. There was a serious problem with that outcome. By the time Frank died, Jenny was suffering from severe dementia and had already been formally declared incapable of managing her own affairs. Newspapers at the time ran headlines bluntly describing the situation, essentially reporting that a woman with no real understanding of what she now possessed had just inherited one of the largest fortunes in the country, with no trust structure, no professional oversight, and no real plan in place to protect or manage any of it. If a piece of history like this, where a headline-making fortune ends up in genuinely precarious hands almost by accident, is the kind of thing you find fascinating, go ahead and subscribe now, because the story only gets more tangled from here. When Jenny Woolworth died in 1924, her estate, valued at tens of millions of dollars, was divided among Frank's 3 surviving daughters, Helena, Jessie, and Edna. Except Edna wasn't actually alive to receive her share directly, and her story is genuinely one of the saddest parts of this entire family history. Edna had married a stockbroker named Franklin Hutton, one of the founders of the well-known investment firm that still carries his name today. Their marriage was deeply unhappy, and in 1917, at just 33 years old, Edna was found dead in a hotel suite. The official cause of death was listed as an infection, though her biographer later concluded that Edna had actually taken her own life, and that the family worked quietly behind the scenes to keep that truth out of the newspapers. The young child who reportedly found her mother that day was only 4 years old. Her name was Barbara. It's worth understanding just how much that single early tragedy shaped everything that followed for Barbara. Losing a parent under such traumatic circumstances at such a young age, combined with growing up inside a family that reportedly chose to hide the true nature of that loss from public view rather than confronting it openly, meant Barbara essentially inherited both an enormous fortune and a significant amount of unresolved grief at the exact same time, with very little emotional support structure in place to help her process either one. Her father, by most accounts, remained emotionally distant throughout much of her upbringing, more focused on his own business affairs and personal life than on raising his daughter directly. Barbara was largely raised by relatives and household staff, rather than by either parent in any consistent, hands-on way, growing up surrounded by extraordinary wealth but remarkably little genuine emotional stability. Because Edna had died before her own mother, her share of the Woolworth fortune passed directly down to that 4-year-old girl. Barbara Hutton therefore inherited from 2 directions at once, first from her grandmother's estate, and later, additional funds tied to her mother's original share as well. By the time attorneys had finished sorting everything out, a young, grieving child was set to receive one of the largest personal inheritances in the entire country, while the broader Woolworth fortune itself had already begun splitting into separate branches, managed independently, with no single coordinated plan holding the whole thing together. By the time Barbara turned 21 in 1933, her father had grown her share of the inheritance to somewhere around $42 million, an amount worth close to $1 billion in today's money. Picture that for a moment. A 21-year-old woman with no job, no financial training, and essentially nobody with real authority to tell her no, suddenly controlling a fortune of that scale. And she inherited it during the worst possible moment in American economic history, the depths of the Great Depression, when roughly 1 in 4 Americans was out of work and families across the country were losing their homes. Just a few years before that 21st birthday, Barbara's family had thrown an extravagant coming-out party reportedly costing around $60,000, worth close to $1 million today. At the exact same time, bread lines were stretching around city blocks. That contrast between her spending and the country's suffering is exactly what turned public opinion against her, and it's where the nickname that would follow her for the rest of her life first appeared in newspapers. The poor little rich girl. It wasn't meant with sympathy. It was written as a sneer. Here's something worth sitting with for a second. Almost everyone still remembers the Woolworth lunch counter fondly. Almost nobody remembers that the fortune built by that same 5-cent idea ended up in the hands of a woman who became, at the very same time, one of the most envied and most genuinely unhappy young women in the entire country. The money never actually made Barbara happy. It made her a target, and the people who came looking for a piece of it were charming, often titled, and remarkably patient. Over the course of her life, Barbara Hutton married 7 times, and most of those marriages followed a strikingly similar pattern. A charming man carrying a title but very little money of his own, a fast, glamorous courtship, an expensive wedding, and eventually a quiet, costly divorce. Her first husband was a Georgian prince, and during that marriage, he reportedly spent through millions of her money on houses, polo ponies, and jewelry, walking away considerably richer than he had arrived. That basic pattern repeated itself with husband after husband, with one notable exception whose name most people still recognize today, the actor Cary Grant. Grant was already independently wealthy and successful in his own right, and when their marriage ended, he famously took nothing from the settlement at all. Newspapers at the time nicknamed the couple Cash and Carrie, and Grant remains remembered as the rare husband in her life who genuinely didn't seem interested in her money. It's worth pointing out just how unusual that made Grant among the men in Barbara's life, and why the press found the contrast so notable at the time. By the point Barbara married Grant, she had already been through enough painful, expensive divorces that the public had essentially come to expect every new marriage to end the same way, with another settlement, another payout, another headline about how much it had cost her this time. Grant breaking that pattern completely, walking away with nothing, despite having every opportunity to negotiate a substantial settlement, became almost as newsworthy as the marriages that had drained her fortune in the first place. It said something about him, certainly, but it also quietly highlighted just how consistently the other men in her life had approached their marriages as financial opportunities, rather than genuine partnerships. Then there was her marriage to Porfirio Rubirosa, an internationally famous playboy. That particular marriage lasted just 53 days. In that incredibly short window, Barbara reportedly handed him a settlement worth around $2.5 million, along with polo ponies, a converted aircraft, and an entire coffee plantation. A fortune's worth of assets, gone in less than 2 months of marriage. Rubirosa himself was already a well-known figure among European high society at the time, having previously been married into another wealthy family. And his reputation for pursuing and quickly extracting fortunes from wealthy women was already fairly well established before he ever met Barbara. Their whirlwind courtship and rapid marriage fit his established pattern almost perfectly, and the speed of the eventual divorce, barely enough time for the ink on the marriage certificate to properly dry, became one of the most talked about scandals of that particular social season. If watching someone's life unravel through pattern after repeating pattern like this is genuinely compelling to you, hit that subscribe button, because we still need to walk through exactly where the rest of that billion-dollar fortune actually went, and the full math is honestly staggering. The marriages alone, as costly as they were, don't fully explain how an entire billion-dollar fortune eventually disappeared. To really understand it, you have to add up several different forces working against the money at the same time. Start with those repeated divorce settlements, each one carrying away a meaningful chunk of the total. Then add her personal spending habits, which were genuinely extreme even by the standards of the ultra-wealthy, with reports of her spending close to $100,000 in a single day at various points in her life. Add the houses, the jewelry collections, the full-time household staff, and years spent living in hotel suites rather than any permanent home. Add her genuine charitable generosity as well, since she did give away meaningful sums over the years, including a London mansion that today still serves as the official residence of the United States ambassador to the United Kingdom. It's worth pausing on that generosity for a moment, because it complicates the simple narrative of Barbara Hutton as purely reckless or careless with money. She reportedly funded hospitals, supported various charitable causes throughout her life, and gave away substantial sums to causes and individuals she genuinely cared about, separate entirely from what her various husbands walked away with. This wasn't a woman who only spent on herself. She spent in every direction at once, on husbands, on causes, on possessions, on maintaining an image the public expected of her, without any single unifying financial strategy holding any of it together, or ensuring the core of the fortune remained intact through all of that outward flow. And then add the piece almost nobody warns young heirs about clearly enough: taxes. Across the span of her lifetime, tax rates on large American estates climbed dramatically, from roughly a quarter of an estate's total value up to as much as 70% at their peak. Every single transfer of wealth along the Woolworth family line got reduced by the government at each stage, with no trust structure or protective planning in place to soften any of those repeated blows. Add all of that together, decade after decade, marriage after marriage, and the math only ends one way. By the time Barbara Hutton died in 1979 at 66 years old, her own biographer reported that what remained of her fortune came to roughly $3,500. Now, it would be easy to walk away from this story thinking Barbara Hutton was simply reckless, or that she was surrounded by people determined to take advantage of her, and both of those things are genuinely true. But focusing only on that misses the deeper lesson sitting underneath the whole story. The real failure was never simply that she spent the money. It's that nobody ever built any kind of structure to protect that fortune from the very person who inherited it. No trust, no professional oversight, no guardrails of any kind. A traumatized 21-year-old was handed the equivalent of $1 billion and essentially wished good luck. And to really see why that missing structure mattered so much, look at what happened to the actual company behind the fortune, because that part of the story takes a turn almost nobody expects. You'd assume the Woolworth Company itself simply collapsed alongside the family fortune, and on the surface, that's almost what happened. Through the 1960s, new competitors like Walmart, Kmart, and Target all opened their doors in the very same year, 1962, and the old 5 and dime model suddenly looked outdated overnight. Woolworths tried launching its own discount chain to compete and largely failed. In 1997, the very last American Woolworths store closed its doors for good, and the red and gold sign that had hung on main streets across the country for more than a century came down permanently. But here's the part of the story that usually gets left out entirely. The company itself didn't actually die. Years earlier, Woolworths had quietly acquired a small shoe business, and in 1974, it used that business to launch an entirely new kind of store, one focused specifically on athletic sneakers. They called it Foot Locker. By the late 1990s, as the traditional variety stores kept struggling, that sneaker business had become the only genuinely thriving part of the entire company. So the corporation made an almost unprecedented decision. It walked away from its own historic name entirely. In 1998, it renamed itself the Venator Group, and by 2001, it had rebranded completely into what we know today, Foot Locker. So the next time you walk past a Foot Locker in a shopping mall, understand what you're actually looking at. That is Woolworths, the very same corporate lineage, born from a 5-cent idea in 1879, still operating today, just wearing an entirely different uniform. There's a genuine lesson buried inside that corporate survival story too, one that mirrors the personal lesson about the family fortune almost perfectly. The company survived specifically because whoever was making decisions at the corporate level was willing to look honestly at what was actually working and what wasn't, and to make a genuinely difficult, identity-altering change once the original business model had clearly run its course. That's a fundamentally different kind of decision-making than simply inheriting an existing pile of money and being expected to manage it wisely without any guidance or structure. The company had shareholders, boards, and professional executives, all forced to confront hard financial reality and adapt accordingly. Barbara Hutton, by contrast, had none of those checks in place, nobody with real institutional authority ever stepping in to suggest a fundamentally different approach before it was far too late to matter. There's a genuine irony sitting right at the center of this whole story. The company survived precisely because it was willing to completely reinvent itself from the ground up when it needed to. The family fortune collapsed because nobody ever reinvented how it was actually held and protected across generations. So why does one great American fortune vanish within a couple of generations, while another one, built during that exact same era, manages to last a century or longer? It isn't really luck, and it isn't simply the size of the money involved either. It comes down to structure. To really see that difference clearly, it helps to compare the Woolworth story to another major American fortune built around the same time, the Rockefellers. When the Rockefeller fortune passed down through the generations, it was never simply handed out in enormous lump sums to 21-year-olds. Instead, the core of that wealth was placed into carefully constructed trusts run by professional trustees rather than by any single family member alone. The money was pooled together and actively protected, specifically so that no individual heir could single-handedly spend it down to nothing, and so the fortune wouldn't fracture and shrink dramatically with every single generational transfer the way the Woolworth money eventually did. The family went even further than that, establishing a dedicated private office specifically to manage their collective wealth, staffed with accountants, lawyers, and professional investment managers running the family's finances as one coordinated ongoing operation across many decades and multiple generations of descendants. No Rockefeller heir was ever simply handed a massive personal fortune at 21 and left entirely on their own. Barbara Hutton was. It's worth being clear about why this particular kind of structure works so effectively, because it isn't really about restricting an heir's access to money out of pure caution or distrust. A well-built trust, run by professional trustees, answerable to the broader family rather than to any single impulsive decision-maker, allows money to keep growing and compounding as one coordinated pool of capital, rather than being split into dozens of smaller, independently managed pieces that each face their own separate risks, poor decisions, expensive divorces, and tax events along the way. It also provides a layer of professional judgment sitting between a young, potentially inexperienced heir and an enormous, life-altering sum of money, without necessarily removing that heir's ability to benefit from the income the fortune generates. Barbara Hutton never had access to anything resembling that kind of protective structure. She had lawyers managing paperwork and handling logistics, certainly, but nothing resembling an institution actively working to preserve the underlying fortune itself across her lifetime and beyond it. That comparison really is the entire difference, captured in a single idea. The Woolworths built one of the truly great fortunes in American business history, earned honestly, nickel by nickel, from ordinary families shopping at a store that felt like it belonged to their own community. But Frank Woolworth ultimately left that fortune in the old-fashioned way, passed down directly, undivided by any protective planning, and left essentially unguarded. By the time his granddaughter died alone in a hotel room in 1979, a woman who had once controlled the equivalent of nearly $1 billion was left, according to her own biographer, with $3,500 to her name. The real difference was never how much money existed in the first place. It was whether anyone ever bothered to build something specifically designed to outlive the person who first created it. The Rockefellers built a wall around their fortune. The Woolworths, in the end, only ever built the store. Here's what makes this story land even harder than a simple cautionary tale about one unlucky heiress. Almost none of us will ever personally inherit anything close to $1 billion, but the underlying lesson here is genuinely the exact same one that separates families who manage to keep their wealth intact from families who eventually lose it, and it has surprisingly little to do with how much money anyone starts out with. It comes down entirely to whether anyone in that family ever takes the time to build real structure around the money, specifically designed to protect it from the very people who will one day inherit it. Frank Woolworth could personally fund construction of the tallest building on the planet using nothing but cash. He could not protect his own great-granddaughter from being handed far too much money, far too young, with almost nothing in place around her to help guide or protect it. The store he built on Main Street ultimately outlived the family that originally owned it. It just had to completely reinvent itself as a sneaker company in order to survive. If this story helped you understand why structure genuinely matters more than the size of a fortune itself, let me know in the comments which part actually surprised you most, whether it was learning that Foot Locker used to be Woolworths, or just how quickly nearly $1 billion can completely disappear without the right protections in place. Share this with anyone you know who genuinely find this as fascinating as you clearly do, and make sure you're following this channel because we've got plenty more stories like this one still to come. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.